Hey there tech fans, Rick here again from the O-Ray team. In today's video, I'd like to pass along a few tips to help you avoid some of the issues you may encounter when installing an HDMI extension kit like the one I have in front of me. Now normally, these kits are incredibly easy to install, and in less than 30 minutes, you can extend HDMI media content from one location to a second remote location in your home or in your office. But every now and then, you may encounter an issue, so I want to help you get through that installation process as smoothly and quickly as possible so you can enjoy that HDMI media content at that second location. And before I get too deep into all the troubleshooting tips I'm about to explain, I thought I'd start off with a basic understanding of how an HDMI extender kit works. Now, every HDMI extender kit on the market includes two main components: a transmitter module, which is located at the primary site, and that's wherever the media content is currently that you'd like to share with your remote location, and a receiver module that's located at the secondary site wherever you'd like to enjoy that content. And these modules are connected to each other either through a LAN cable like I have here, a coaxial cable, or even through a wireless connection. And there are a few things to keep in mind when you're first setting up the installation that'll help you avoid some of the issues down the road. The first thing I want to talk about in general is power and cabling, because both of those are very common issues with an installation like this. So let's start with power. Typically, each of the modules have their own power supplies. You'll plug one in over here, you'll connect it to the module, and it provides all the power you'll need for operation. The same with the remote location. But some of the kits include a technology called power over cable, where a single power supply is all you'll need for the entire solution, and you can add that to the transmitter module or the receiver module, and the power required for the other module is sent across that same connection, so both modules are powered by a single power supply. Sometimes you're plugging those power supplies into a large power strip with your TV plugged in, some of your other media gear plugged in, and all of those components draw current out of that particular strip. And the problem is the voltage may drop enough where you're causing kind of issues with those modules. They're not getting enough voltage and current to the modules to actually operate correctly. So the first thing I would check in any installation is if you're having issues sending that HDMI media content from here to here, unplug those power supplies from that power strip and plug them directly into the wall to see if that helps clear things up. The next issue is cables, and there's a lot of things to keep in mind around cabling, because essentially you'll connect to the transmitter module with an HDMI cable from your media player. You'll connect an interconnect between the two modules, whether it be a LAN cable or coax, and then you'll have another HDMI cable at the remote site between the receiver and the monitor on that end. All of those cables are really critical in transmitting that video content to that remote location. So let's start with the interconnect. When you're using a LAN cable, please try to use the highest quality LAN cable you can find, typically a Cat 6 or a Cat 7. There's not much of a price difference between the Cat 6 and Cat 7 cables, so I always recommend running a Cat 7 cable if possible, because you may want to upgrade the system later on to higher resolution content, and knowing you've got a high quality cable between the two locations ensures that you can replace these two modules if needed later on with ones that can support higher resolution and not have to worry about the interconnect. If you can use a shielded cable, even better. So that's the first consideration. The second consideration, which a lot of people forget about, is the content has to get from your media player to the transmitter. And if you're using an old HDMI cable that doesn't support higher resolutions or maybe isn't that great in connection, you're going to have issues getting the media content to the transmitter, and it's never going to make it across that connection to the receiver to the remote location. So I always recommend with the HDMI cables, when you're installing a system like this, buy brand new cables and buy high quality cables, high speed cables if you can work those into your budget, and that'll ensure you'll have no issues whatsoever transmitting content from your media player to your transmitter, and then it can take responsibility of sending it across that LAN connection between them. So the first thing you'll want to check is power and cables. If you've eliminated that, it's important to understand where the problem's occurring. So if the content isn't making it to the remote location, there are really three places that can break down: on the transmitter side, in the interconnect, or on the receiver side. So I'll start with the transmitter side. When you're connecting an HDMI product up to a transmitter, the HDMI cable is critically important, but there are a couple of things you can check here. So for example, forget for a second that you're trying to transmit to a remote location. A lot of the transmitter modules like this one have a local loopback functionality, which allows you to enjoy the content here while you're simultaneously broadcasting it to the secondary location. So the first thing you'll want to check is to see if that loopback is working. So plug the media player into the transmitter and then connect up a local monitor. And if you get content here, the transmitter is pretty much working at that point, and your issue is either in the interconnect cable or in the receiver end. But that's the first thing you'll want to check. The second thing you'll want to check is on the transmitter module, there are typically two indicators. You'll see one for power and you'll see one for transmission. Sometimes they'll call it connection, but the power light should be on because the unit's going to go through a power on self-test when you first power it up. If it passes that test, which is a good indication it's working, it'll light up that power LED. But you'll also want to see the second light blinking. You can see it blinking right there. And it could be a separate LED, or it might actually be on the LAN connection right here, because the LAN port sometimes has a green and a yellow light on it, depending on the model of transmitter and receiver you're using. But on that LAN port, you'll see a green light and an orange light. The green light is for power, so that should be on. The orange light should be blinking when you're transmitting data across that interconnect between the two modules. So check all those things on the transmitter side. But again, the rule of thumb is if you're seeing content here from the loop out, the transmitter's working okay. Now I'll talk about the receiver, then we'll talk a little bit more about the interconnect. So on the receiver module, you'll see the same LEDs on some of the versions. Other ones, again, will have the lights on the LEDs, or should say LEDs right here in the LAN connection. Either way, you should see a power LED at the remote site, and you should see a blinking light here as well. That's indicating that content is being sent from the transmitter across the interconnect to the receiver, and it's being picked up at the receiver end. Now, if you're still not seeing images over here, we have to check the connection between them, but let me get to this first. So the monitor on this side has a resolution set, and you're sending a certain resolution content across here. Now, some of the HDMI extension kits can actually downsize the resolution. So if it's a 4K image here, and you've only got a 1080p monitor here, the system will convert that 4K to 1080p so you can display the content over here. Other systems won't. So it's very important you check the resolution of the content you're sending to the transmitter, the resolution the transmitter can handle, and a lot of times you can reconfigure your media content. For example, if this is a 1080p transmitter, you'll want to transmit it in 1080p. If it's 4K, you want to set it up for 4K. The same is true on the receiver end. You have control over here from the monitor side to decide what resolution and frame rate this is going to transmit to the monitor. So let's say, for example, you've got a 4K unit over here. This is 1080p. It's not going to transmit 4K if it can't downres, so you have to make sure that you've reconfigured that to 1080p. The same is true over here. If you have this set up for 4K, it may not display, so it could be a configuration on the monitor, but more often than not, it has to do with a feature called EDID, which is a way for you to adjust the frame rate and resolution of the content being sent across here. And all of these kits have pretty extensive manuals that explain the EDID settings in those manuals. And if you need to reset the EDID, you want to switch those switches to conform to whatever resolution or frame rate you're sending across the interconnect. And then you'll want to reboot both of the modules, because typically EDID settings are only read when the things are powered up. Now let's talk about the interconnect next, because that's really the last thing that causes you issues. If you're having problems at this point where you know you've configured the receiver correctly, you've configured the transmitter correctly, you've checked the EDID settings, you've plugged it into a wall outlet, the thing you want to try next to eliminate is the cable. And the best way to do that, and it's a little bit of a pain, is to take a small monitor to the primary site, use a shorter length of cable, plug this into the transmitter, and if you get an image there, then you know for sure it's the cable. Now, if it is the cable, check for breaks, check for kinks. A lot of the LAN cables don't do really well when you're making turns around corners, especially if you routed that cable through a wall up to the attic, maybe across the attic and down another wall. There's a lot of potential there for damaging the cable between those two particular locations. And you can find LAN connection test kits on a lot of the public sites out there that you can buy for not a lot of money that'll verify the cable between those two locations is fine and it's working okay. But what I always recommend is, even though it's less expensive to run standard cable and add your own connections to it, I always recommend buying a cable that's pre-made with the connections on either end, because then you're sure that they've tested it before they've shipped it to you, and there's less chance of you having issues down the road. But if you take the receiver module close to the transmitter module and plug it in and it works there, then you've got a cabling issue and you've got to replace that cable. So take your time, pull the cable back out, check for nicks and bends and cracks, and if you can't find any, replace that cable with a new 100-foot or 200-foot cable, whatever that run would entail. And that's pretty much it between the two. And like I'd mentioned from the beginning, it's a very simple kit to install. A few simple connections on the primary side to your media product and a local loopback if you're going to use that. A LAN connection between the two. And on the receiver end, you've got a single HDMI cable to the monitor and a power connection. And you should be able to just plug it in, because most of these systems nowadays are smart enough to make up for issues that you may not have noticed, and they'll self-correct. Like I'd mentioned before about changing the resolution to match the monitor, a lot of them will self-correct for those issues. So I hope you found these troubleshooting tips helpful. That's all I really had for today. So until next time, thanks for watching.